The Soviet Union has fallen, and as a former KGB agent, 43-year-old Vladimir Putin is now jobless and alone, with seemingly no prospects. However, fast forward 5 years, and Putin is one of the most powerful men in the world. But opinion on Putin is split over whether he's a hero or the devil. You see, Vladimir Putin's life is wrapped in murder, revenge, betrayal, and now, potentially, World War III. We'll not only look at the full story of Putin, but also see what Putin's inner circle had to say about him. For instance, why were Putin's enemies mysteriously dying one by one? Was this truly a coincidence? This is the full secret story of Vladimirovich Putin. To tell the story of the Vladimir Putin we know today, we first have to go back to a very different time, back when what we now know of as Russia was a part of the larger Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or Soviet Union for short. Born on October the 7th, 1952, Vladimir Putin was raised in St. Petersburg, in Russia. Putin was a small, skinny kid who was constantly getting bullied. Even now, he's only 5'7", and because of that, Putin developed a honey badger attitude. He'd fight anyone. One day, his teacher complained to Putin's father that Vladimir had no future prospects and was getting into too many fights. But his dad, being a tough Russian, brushed off the teacher and said, "Well, what can I do? Kill him or what?" Putin was a lonely outsider, getting no respect from his friends or his teacher. However, Putin's life changed forever when he walked into a movie theatre for the first time. In the theatre, Putin watched a movie about World War II where the main character went behind enemy lines in Nazi Germany. Putin was so captivated by the movie that he promised himself that he would one day be like that man. Soon after, Putin walked into a KGB office, the Soviet equivalent of the CIA, and he asked an officer there how he could join the KGB. The officer told Putin that if he was to go to university and study law, he might get a chance to get recruited. And so, after leaving the KGB office, Putin did a 180, going from being a disobedient, lazy kid to becoming a militaristically disciplined man. He made a list of what he needed to do to become a KGB agent and started to resolutely work through it. However, despite Putin's ambition, he was still a very shy and quiet kid, and people laughed and bullied him whenever he worked towards his dreams. Putin faced naysayers and physical bullying, but no amount of humiliation was going to stop him. And in his 4th year of university, he actually got recruited by the KGB. But after a couple of years of diligent work, Putin realized this might not be the dream that he had envisioned from the movies. Putin was sent to be a counterintelligence agent, where he cultivated relationships with normal people and got them to turn in their neighbours and associates who might be saying or doing things that the Soviet Union did not approve of. But in 9 years of working as an agent, there was not one single spy caught in his hometown. The dream of becoming the undercover action star was not going to happen inside of Russia. The reason for this unremarkable job was that the Soviet Union didn't like to send unmarried agents abroad because it was thought that they could be seduced and then flipped into double agents or blackmailed. It was a liability to have unmarried agents in the field. And at this point, Putin was still unmarried. Eventually, at the age of 30, he finally did get married, and it was at this point he was promoted to major and sent to the School of Foreign Intelligence in Moscow. This was a boot camp for foreign spies. Putin was finally going to get to live his secret agent dream. But just a few weeks into living his dream, Putin got into trouble. He got into a stupid fight with some guys on the metro, in which he broke his arm. The KGB knew he'd got into a fight, and this altered his trajectory at the KGB. So instead, Putin was sent to East Germany. At this time, East Germany was irrelevant. No one was spying on the Germans. There was no important work to be done. But being the loyal, hard-working man, Putin put his head down and got to work. People in the office often described Putin as a solid but unambitious guy. Someone who wasn't gunning for the top. But as the Berlin Wall came down, everything was about to change. In 1989, the Soviet Union was breaking apart and losing its grip on East Germany. After the Berlin Wall came down, German intelligence came under attack from protesters. Whilst it was the German intelligence getting attacked, Putin was also in danger, as the KGB offices were up next. The Russians had top-secret confidential files that would be compromising if found and distributed, and Putin didn't want the KGB headquarters being ransacked by a bunch of civilians. So, as more and more protesters continued to gather, growing more and more strong, Putin calls to the Soviet military base for help, but nobody was there to answer his calls. Putin felt totally betrayed. The phrase, "Moscow is silent," haunted him. But now was not the time to feel haunted or betrayed, as the German crowd was getting bigger and suffering under the thumb of the Soviets. The crowds were about to take down the KGB. Other than a locked gate and a few men with pistols, the KGB had no defense. Crowds were marching towards the KGB office, and then,
"This house is strictly guarded. My soldiers have weapons and I gave them orders. If anyone enters the compound, they are to open fire."
Putin didn't shout, but calmly delivered his message and walked back to the office. To the KGB's surprise, the crowd thought better and dispersed and walked away. Whilst the attack from the protesters was prevented, the KGB in Dresden had to close up the building, destroy the documents, and all of its employees had to head back to Russia. This also meant 43-year-old Putin was now unemployed and had lost his only source of income. Putin had just witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union. He realized he was not the only KGB agent back in town from foreign assignment and looking for a new job. There were no new positions, and he'd just turned 43 years old. You'd think if someone was going to achieve true greatness in their life, they would have already accomplished something by 43, or at least be on track. But here is Putin, out of a job, and strongly considering giving up his dream and becoming a judo instructor. But things were about to change. In 1998, Putin was appointed to become head of the FSB, which was Russia's new intelligence organization. At this point in time, the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, needed someone loyal and disciplined that could resist corruption, but most of all, someone with a deep understanding of the intelligence services. Putin was the perfect choice, but Putin actually dismissed Yeltsin's offer multiple times. He didn't want to be the face of this big organization anymore. Now, Putin was tired and traumatized by all the secrecy involved with being a secret agent, but the more reluctant Putin was, the more Yeltsin wanted Putin by his side, and with Yeltsin's constant push, Putin became the Prime Minister, the second most powerful position in Russia. However, Putin's prime ministerial position came with a massive challenge. Russia was still in an unpredictable position. Although the First Chechen War had theoretically granted Chechnya, a predominantly Muslim country, independence from the Orthodox Christian Russia several years previously, to all intents and purposes, it remained a part of the Russian Federation. Chechnya was not happy with this, and had been trying to break away and become a completely independent country. So, if Putin truly wanted to save Russia by not losing Chechnya, and to make it strong as he desired, he would have to make some tough calls that would brutally kill thousands of innocent people. Putin had witnessed the Soviet Union fall before his eyes, and now separatists in Chechnya were trying to break apart the country. This enraged him, so he immediately went to the war zone. This set him apart from other politicians. Russian politicians never did anything that would put their lives in danger. Upon arrival, Putin declared that they should go all in and bang the hell out of the bandits. This increase in aggression ended with catastrophic casualties. Russian forces were losing, which was humiliating. They used to be a part of something special, a global superpower that could go toe-to-toe with the United States. Now it seemed like they couldn't even beat poorly armed rebels. But despite the nightmare, Putin's involvement gave the Russian people hope. And in December 1999, Yeltsin announced that he was going to step down, and Vladimir Putin became the president of Russia. But now that Putin had come to power, people in Russia started to question, how did an unemployed man rise to such a high position in just 5 years? Was there perhaps a darker reason behind it? During September 1999, a number of apartment blocks in various Russian cities were wrecked by explosions, killing over 300 people. Naturally, the Russian government blamed the bombings on Chechen militants. Chechnya vehemently denied. Curiously, one of the explosions happened 3 days after it was reported by Russian state media. Later that month, a suspicious device, very similar to the ones used in those bombings, was defused in an apartment block in another Russian city. The local police traced the planting of the bombs to 3 FSB agents who were arrested. The FSB later claimed that the devices were duds, and that this had merely been an anti-terror drill. Did Putin orchestrate these bombings in order to boost his popularity and give him justification for an all-out war in Chechnya? We will never know for sure, but it certainly leads one to wonder if Putin bombed hundreds of Russians in order to legitimize military actions in Chechnya that he thought were necessary to preserve Russia. While there were no major media outlets that dared to be too critical of Putin, some individuals started to investigate and report the dark side of it. And before long, Russian citizens were able to learn more about the tyrannical nature of their leader. But that didn't last long, as just a few months later, Anna Polikovskaya, a Russian-American investigative journalist who was critical about Putin, was shot dead in her apartment building. And 6 weeks after Anna's death, Alexander Litvinenko, who was a friend of Anna, died from poisoning by a radioactive isotope. People who were exposing Putin were getting silently murdered. But when Putin was asked about this issue, he vigorously denied any involvement, saying he had no incentive to murder these people and claiming that their death was causing him more problems now. But in reality, this created an environment where individuals were too afraid to speak out against Putin for fear of what might happen to them. It made his control over the national conversation in Russia complete. But despite his rise to power, there were also times when Putin got humiliated by the public and the media. When Putin first became president, TV channels mocked him. The media were portraying Putin as a tiny, little, bald man who was too small and too weak to run Russia. Behind closed doors, Putin cooked up some charges, and in a very short period of time, he took control of all 3 major television networks in Russia. As a former spy, Putin was best at leveraging knowledge asymmetry. He was able to gather intel about everybody, whilst managing to keep his enemies from knowing anything about him. While he was facing external attacks, Russia was just starting out. Citizens were going through hard times. GDP was really low. So in his first year in office, Putin started taking care of the uncomfortable stuff first. And as a result, Russia's GDP doubled. Unemployment went down, income went up, and the Russian government was able to pay off its debt ahead of schedule. Things were looking bright for Russia. However, good times didn't last, as people started to come after Putin's position. In 2003, the economy was no longer growing, but worst of all, the number of terrorist attacks started to increase. And among the chaos, people started to believe that Putin was vulnerable. As a consequence, Russian billionaires started to go after Putin. The powerful Russian oligarchy started funding opposition parties in Russia's parliament in an attempt to create a democratic Russia. Putin was not very receptive to the concept of being challenged. Very shortly after, Putin declared he was going to take down the oligarchs. In a televised press conference, Putin publicly announced that those who combine power and capital, these oligarchs, will cease to exist as a class, a separation of business and politics. This was a very popular move amongst the Russian public, who hated seeing the oligarchs live like royalty and do whatever they want, whilst most of Russia struggled. In private, Putin gave the oligarchs a simple proposition. You can keep your wealth if you pay some form of tribute to me and then stay out of politics and stay out of my way. Many oligarchs complied, and yet Putin never left things to chance and rigged the election to become the president again. However, for Putin, this meant things were about to get a lot worse. On the morning of September the 1st, 2004, the local school was full of new students and parents who had come with them. The day started out as normal, with teachers, students and parents meeting and celebrating. But then at 9 AM, about 40 masked men suddenly ran onto the school's grounds, firing AK-47s in the air, and herded 800 people into the school gymnasium, which they wired with homemade bombs. They made demands that Russian troops pull out of Chechnya and grant it complete independence. Of course, that was never going to happen. The Russian military set up a perimeter around the school, looking for a way to save the hostages. But these terrorists were not messing around. On the first day, they started killing people one by one and throwing their bodies out of the gymnasium. Putin was faced with a difficult choice on what to do with this situation. He could either let the hostages die one by one and buy more time, or he could just attack and kill both the terrorists and some of the hostages. Not only did Putin choose the second option, but he gained more popularity because of it. 334 hostages, 10 Russian commandos, and 30 terrorists were killed. This could be a political disaster for Putin. But instead of apologizing or accepting responsibility, Putin reflected on the situation and said that if Russia is strong again, the Russians won't have to deal with this anymore. So he was going to make the country strong again. The Russians accepted this. But what exactly did make Russia strong again mean? Well, for people who were well connected with Putin, it meant they were going to get promoted. Among those people were his judo teachers, who were given the chance to work as governors and mayors. As for those who were already working in government, well, they were going to get removed, and all elections for governor and mayor were abolished. Putin would appoint them all personally. He became more powerful than ever. But this rise of power was about to hit a ceiling. The Russian constitution stated that the same person could not hold the position of president for more than 2 consecutive terms, and his second term of presidency was coming to an end. Putin needed to pick a successor. The successor he chose was Dmitry Medvedev, a very mild-mannered bureaucrat. But you see, now that Putin had tasted what power felt like, he had no plans to step down. Instead, he made a deal with Dmitry. In exchange for making Dmitry president, Dmitry would nominate Putin as prime minister, the second most powerful position in Russia. However, while many of Putin's critics call this whole arrangement a shameless power grab, Putin truly believed it was the best way to save Russia, even going as far as rewriting the constitution that would make him president again. The turning point came when the country of Georgia commenced an attack on the region of South Ossetia. South Ossetia was a province that was mostly ethnically Russian and had distanced itself from Georgia so as to strengthen ties with Russia. When the Georgian government started to attack them, Dmitry was indecisive. When Russian commanders asked what to do, Medvedev couldn't answer and called Putin. However, Putin was at the Beijing Olympics at the time and couldn't be reached. When Putin eventually found out about the matter, he was enraged by Medvedev's indecisiveness and lack of resolve. And so, Putin orchestrated the writing of a change to the constitution that would extend presidential terms to 6 years. And in 2012, Putin returned to the presidency, and he's been serving in that capacity ever since. He won the 2024 presidential election with 88% of the vote, the highest percentage yet recorded in a post-Soviet Russian presidential election. But Putin had something more he wanted to do, because on February the 22nd, 2022, Russia started invading Ukraine, marking the beginning of what could lead to World War III. And throughout the course of it, Vladimir Putin would reveal his true intention behind this war. Up until this point, Russia had been recovering from the fall of the Soviet Union. But with Putin's leadership, Russia was quickly rising to the top of the nations, each year getting stronger. He even did his best to open a friendly hand to the US after 9/11. However, that all changed when President Bush failed to listen to his objections and built anti-missile bases in the Czech Republic and Poland. The animosity solidified over the years. But it wasn't until the late 2000s that Putin realized that many countries were also dissatisfied with the United States. So he took it upon himself to become the USA's arch-enemy. This gave him popularity both at home and in other countries. He started building alliances with countries such as China, India, and Saudi Arabia. And yet, Putin had a darker reason behind making these alliances.
We're coming on the air at this hour with breaking news after the U.S. warned all day of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it was imminent. Vladimir Putin.
The war brought the world to a panic. Was Putin going to be the second Hitler?
Very eerie comment. He said, if you see American troops in combat with Russian soldiers, that would be blood. That would mean World War III. He has no intention of doing that. He has made that clear. And David, we talked about those polls. This is not what Americans want to see. They want minimal engagement in this conflict there.
And 2 years later,
our senior United States senators from the state of New York, Chuck Schumer, said yesterday, I believe, that we have to continue to fund the Ukrainian effort, or U.S. soldiers, citizens could wind up fighting there. How do you assess that?
Whatever the truth is, remember this. Money, politics, and greed from both sides are killing thousands of people every single day, and we can only hope that this war will end and peace will come.